Okay, well, welcome everyone to this FDC event. We're glad you could join us. Thank you for each one of you for attending. This is our October event. We've had two other events. The previous one was late and gray. Hopefully you had a chance to either be there or if not, watch that event. It's posted on our website. I'd like to encourage you to do a couple of things as attendees. First of all, I encourage you to donate to Freedom Defense Canada towards our Speaker Series fundraiser. That's an ongoing fundraiser that we have to raise monies towards providing excellent top-notch speakers, which we've done over the years. We'd like to continue to do that. Secondly, if you are not a member of FDC, please join us. Go to our website and join FDC. That way you can support us both financially and also in other ways. We also ask that you would support FDC's social media presence. We have a number of platforms that we're on, including Facebook, where there are posts that you can like, comment, and share. We have a YouTube channel which you can subscribe to, and you'll find previous speakers there. We also have FDC has a Substack and Rumble channel that you can subscribe to as well. And most recently, we started a podcast on Substack. So please check those things out and avail yourselves of all the different resources available that FDC provides. And now I'm going to just explain a little bit of Zoom etiquette and also a comment about our question and answer later. So please, to create an atmosphere of respect, keep your mics muted. That way we have no background noise while the presentation is taking place. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer period. And please, throughout the presentation, feel free to write your questions down. And then when we open up the chat box, you can write them there and we will get our speaker to answer those questions. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce to you our guest speaker for the evening. And that is our very own Perry Foster. You may recognize this man. He is the Communications Director at Freedom Defense Canada. And his field of expertise is education, as some of you may know. And so before we get started into the presentation proper, Perry's going to provide a brief summary of his educational career. So the title of Perry's presentation is Understanding the New Battlefield. A high school teacher recalls the emerging educational culture war. Perry, welcome, and go ahead.
Thanks, Mike. I'll just start with a brief description of my educational career. I've been a lifelong educator. I've been teaching people things since I was 17 years old. I'm 69 now. And I'm still teaching people things in various ways. For 28 years, I was a high school teacher in the BC high school system. And I also lived in Japan for 7.5 years, where I taught in various companies and at a college for a while. So the sum total of my years in teaching and education is 36 years. So I think that qualifies me to speak about education. I hope it does. So Mike, you're muted. Sorry.
There we go. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's okay. Go ahead.
All right, so let's begin the presentation proper then. Thanks for the summary. Perry, when did you first sense that public education was becoming, as you mentioned in the title, an emerging battlefield?
Yeah, it was a gradual process. It began with certain indications about midway through my career. I noticed unsettling changes in the school culture. I was a conservative teacher. Most teachers were not conservative. They were left wing or leaning to the left. And that was fine. We initially, at least, we got along okay, and we cooperated with each other. But it was other changes that I noticed. And ironically, one of those changes was Christmas. So what I noticed in the school system, and it was a system where we'd all gone to Christmas concerts when we were kids, and some of the kids in my last high school had actually experienced Christmas concerts when they were young and in elementary and primary school, was that Christmas could not be fully celebrated. That was an interesting phenomena that began to come up. And I think it was happening in the culture at large too, the war on Christmas, right? What I noticed was that only non-Christian symbols or terms could be used. So for example, if we could have had a Christmas concert, which we couldn't have, I don't think in my last job, we couldn't have simply scheduled a Christmas concert. We couldn't have had a carol like "Oh Holy Night." That would have been absolutely forbidden. Jingle bells might have been possible,
Mm.
but any kind of direct reference to Christianity wasn't acceptable. So I saw this as the beginning of a culture war in school. That's the way it affected me. There were other indicators as well, but this was the beginning of the culture war, and that students were being denied their cultural heritage. So, for example, they all celebrated Christmas. They all loved Christmas. I'm sure they would have been able to contribute to a Christmas concert if they'd had the chance, but that was not part of the school's toolbox anymore. It was not part of the curriculum and not part of the school life. So what struck me was students could learn about other cultures. That was fine, but they couldn't learn about their own culture or even the generation before them and how they revered Christmas. And another thing that happened was that the language began to change. So Christmas concerts were referred to, if they happened at all, as winter events or winter concerts. And I began to realize that sort of progressive language, politically correct language, woke language was seeping into the system.
Mhm.
The use of Merry Christmas was pretty much forbidden. And we experienced this in the culture at large too, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
for sure.
holidays was the preferred greeting or season's greetings. Happy Holidays was once accepted under the understanding that that was Christmas and New Year's and maybe Hanukkah, but Merry Christmas was not accepted. So I defied all this. I was an incredible radical, I mean, I would hang a big banner in my classroom that said Merry Christmas. I had 2 Christmas trees in my room. I decorated all parts of the room with Christmas decorations, and the students would come along sometimes and thank me for that, right? But eventually, I just became the only teacher who was doing this. At the end of my career, when I retired, I was indeed the only teacher that put up Christmas decorations.
Amazing.
Yeah, I know. So the change in language was adopted without question. That's what kind of shocked me. Everyone just accepted this. No one else decorated their room for Christmas. Everybody started saying happy holidays and so on. So I want to reference something from a professor, Eric Kaufman, a Canadian professor in the United Kingdom, who talks a lot about this kind of thing. And he talked about the nice ideology that people have fallen prey to. So in the school system, the society at large was pushing the idea that the society was colonialist or was systemically racist or it was an oppressor oppressed kind of paradigm. So I think the schools were listening to this and saying, well, we must do something. We have to do something about this. To challenge an opinion on this was considered to be either unkind or politically incorrect or something like that. So people didn't. They just fell into it, right?
Yeah.
And those kind of binary terms, what they do is they trap and label non-conforming views, and I had the non-conforming views. So as a conservative teacher, who I didn't hide my conservatism at all, I expected actually to be called into the principal's office on several occasions, and maybe even sent to the district office. I mean, it really did feel that way, right?
Oh,
Because I was celebrating Christmas, and not only did I celebrate Christmas, I actually sent to the United States to a company to get red and green bands that people wear on wristbands. And the band said, just say Merry Christmas. So around Christmas time, if the kids got the right answer, I would toss them a band, right? They loved it. But I thought, okay, the thought police are going to catch up with me someday, right?
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, in that strange way, I was an involuntary dissident, right? That's what I became, right?
Yeah, it started early, Perry.
Yeah, started early. And in retrospect, what I could see was that a compliance culture was emerging, right? People were complying to the new ideology, and they were using the correct terms, rather than speaking as they had spoken for many, many years, right? I wondered if the schools were just seemed to be doing the right thing. And I know a lot of other educational experts feel the same way in the UK. I've been watching videos about this. about how the school system doesn't want to offend, it wants to include everybody. But I think this is mutated into another kind of thinking. And the other kind of thinking is, it isn't enough, for example, for you to be against racism, which any rational person would be against. You have to be actively anti-racist as they perceive it.
Right. Yeah.
So, so a lot of things began to come. I'll describe some of them later in the curriculum. But I think this was the influence of various authors, the George Floyd incident and the BLM incident, which were permeating into the culture. So, for example, White Fragility, a book by Robin DiAngelo, became a common term, or How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, this textbook for people, and telling them basically how to think, how to act, what words to use, right? And a second issue that I noticed besides Christmas was climate change.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, climate change is a curricular topic. So I noticed that schools and a lot of teachers were adopting a reductive kind of thinking. So I'll just explain what that means to me. So reductive thinking means that you take a complex issue and reduce it to simple terms. It's either for it or against it. All alternate points of view are either not taken into account or they're not valued. Diverse evidence and scientific opinions are discouraged. And when it came to climate change, I had a couple of anecdotal incidents I'd just like to tell you about. I had a colleague, and this colleague noticed that another teacher was giving a presentation on the tar sands in Alberta, right? So he went up to him and said, well, don't you think you should give the other side of the argument about the tar sands, like perhaps even the oil and gas industry, or something against or opposed to the climate change narrative? And the original teacher said, no, they don't need to hear that. They've already heard that. But in fact, the students had not heard that. And the presentation was completely one-sided. So when I realized that that was happening, I realized that speakers who were against this narrative were not welcome. They were basically being canceled, right?
Right.
And the assumption was that the students had heard all this counter climate change narrative already, and they hadn't, right?
Yep, very true.
So in 2015, I retired. So I caught the beginning of this in some ways, right? Still able as a conservative teacher to function and do my job and so on. Although it was a kind of little bit of trepidation there.
Yeah.
But after I retired in 2015, then about a year after, or a year and a half afterwards, Jordan Peterson burst onto the scenes. Everybody knows Jordan Peterson now. He's an international celebrity, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I looked at his fight for free speech as being one of the most admirable things I'd ever seen. And his willingness to go public was inspirational to me. The most impressive thing about him was that he was able to go against compelled speech. If everybody recalls this, Jordan Peterson they tried to force him to use certain pronouns, and he told them he's not going to use them, right?
Yes.
Okay, this kind of, in a strange way, paralleled my own experience as a teacher. I refused to use certain terms, and so did he. So what did that mean about the school system and education and free speech, right? What did that mean for those issues? His resistance shone a spotlight on the erosion of free speech in universities, which is now a huge issue after all these years, right?
Yeah.
Free speech in the university system, which again, I'll talk about in a minute, but I had seen it in the K-12 system as well. And he defied the woke machine.
Yes.
That's what I admired the most about him, right?
Yeah, for sure.
He was able to have the courage to do this. This basically, in some ways, just launched his career. Another aspect that I realized is as a history teacher, right? As a social studies 11 teacher and as a history enthusiast, I knew very well that the schools could be used by governments as propaganda arms.
Definitely.
Yeah, from history that could happen. Like the Soviet system used that. Mussolini and the fascistic system in Italy used that. And I'll even say that Hitler used that in Nazi Germany, right? So you have to watch that governments don't use the schools as a tool.
Right. Yeah, very true. So now,
go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Um, you were just talking about reductive thinking, which I think is very much kind of the central issue that we're kind of recognizing in education at this time. And you defined it as oversimplifying complex issues.
Right. Yeah.
So you mentioned reductive thinking. Was this a move away from education as you knew it towards a kind of indoctrination? Was that happening? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think it was undeniable that this was happening. But let me just back up a little bit and talk about progressive ideology in
Sure.
the schools, okay? So progressive ideology was permeating the schools, and in my opinion, there was no resisting that, right? It just was like a tsunami that came over the school system. And by progressive ideology, I mean like classic progressive ideas such as the government should right previous wrongs, or we should perhaps have reparations for minority groups, or the government has to play this tremendous role in education. It was almost like a form of statism.
Mhm.
And a couple of anecdotes came to mind about that as well. I have a friend. She had a friend from Lebanon who had come to the Canadian school system and objected to some of the things that were happening. And so he went to the principal, and in the course of the interview, the principal said, you got to remember, these aren't your kids, they are Canada's kids.
Wow.
So for me, that was just a shocking incident, like an example of statism happening within the school system.
Mhm. Definitely.
The other aspect is that with liberalism and liberal ideology, a lot of the times all focus has to be on the disadvantaged groups. There are other aspects to liberal progressivism too, but the disadvantaged groups are the focus. So it sets up this binary, like advantaged, disadvantaged, oppressed, oppressive, and so on and so forth. That's like so common today. It was
Mhm.
beginning in 2014 before I retired, right? So it's no surprise to me that some of this was happening. And then let's go back to your question about reductive thinking then. So
Yeah.
yeah, so this was a move away from education, pure education, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Um, and and uh, and the reason why I felt this way was because I think a true educational system has to encourage diversity of thought. Like the kids have to think about different opinions. They have to think about different viewpoints, whether they like them or not. They should be able to use critical thinking skills to figure out where they stand on the spectrum of thought and how they feel about things. And as the school system went along in my career, less and less of that began to happen, and less critical thinking was introduced. So if I can just quote Plato for a minute here,
Mhm.
education is meant to extend and expand our knowledge, but knowledge in the school system was being reduced.
Right.
So this both concerned and angered me in many cases, right?
Mhm.
Um, One politically point of view, if you talk about indoctrination, then I kind of define it as one political point of view, politically correct point of view is acceptable, all others are not acceptable. Or just one point of view is acceptable, all other points of view are out, right? Or unacceptable.
Right.
So indoctrination happens when students are influenced, and I think the main focus of influence is when they are influenced to think about their opinion or feeling without consulting the facts or the context. That was happening all the time in my classrooms. And at the end, I would have to pull kids up and say, okay, you feel this way, but what's your proof? What are the facts behind your opinion? What is the context historically of this? They didn't really know what to do with that.
Wow.
Yeah, it was very, very concerning at the end. So perhaps I retired at exactly the right time for a guy like me.
Exactly.
Then there are two kinds of indoctrination, in my opinion. One is indoctrination by omission. And
Oh,
indoctrination by omission for me is you take things out of the curriculum. They just
right. Yeah.
disappear. That's perhaps the most frightening kind of indoctrination. Information just disappearing. And anybody who knows the Soviet system knows that that's exactly what happened, right? References to historical figures are simply gone, people and events disappear, and so on and so on. So when I was teaching social studies, I noticed that essential aspects of Canadian history and culture were being removed. Uh,
Mhm.
like the monarchy. Now that seems like a kind of off kind of reference here,
Yeah.
but the monarchy wasn't being mentioned at all or very little in textbooks. And the monarch is the head of state. Even today, the monarch is the head of state of Canada, but not being mentioned at all. Confederation as a process, something that everybody here probably heard about in their school days, was not being fully treated, or it was mentioned incidentally, or it wasn't important. And then Canadian heroes were being eliminated. I did a post recently on a man named Smokey Smith, right? It was a World War II Canadian hero, and various people just didn't even know who he was, right?
No, that's true.
And then Johnny MacDonald was attacked. So that was a particular like pogrom of propaganda against Johnny MacDonald. It was just extraordinary to me. Like, he went from being the architect of Confederation and our first prime minister to being this genocidal figure, a despicable figure. His statues came down across the country and they weren't replaced. That surprised me, because it meant that the mob had control of that. And then second of all, names of schools were changed from Johnny MacDonald to another name. I read once that one of the principals of a school, when it was suggested that Johnny MacDonald be taken off the name of the school, she said, "That's a no-brainer." Well, that is a brainer.
Wow.
That is something, right? I mean, he was a tremendous, tremendous figure in Canadian history, and just being basically disappeared by the state, right, and by the educational system. When I taught Social Studies 11, I always taught a unit on Louis Riel, right? And when I started teaching it, Louis Riel rebellions was the term that we used, the Louis
That's
Riel
right.
rebellions, yeah.
Yeah, the rebellions.
If you look at it historically, Louis Riel did rebel. He actually had a seat in Parliament. He was involved in the postage stamp province of Manitoba, so he did rebel against the government. But now, as time went by, it was called the the Riel resistance. So that's a tremendously
That's quite a switch.
implied difference, right? Implication is that he was resisting colonialism, settlers, the settler term. Maybe he was also resisting white supremacy or the patriarchy, or all of the terms we're getting now that crowd in on our understanding of history.
Mm.
So when I finished the unit, I would say to students, okay, you've got a final assignment. Here's the first assignment. You can write an essay, 5-paragraph preferably, right, about how Louis Riel was a hero. And most of them did that because they're teenagers and they have a feeling about unfairness. Right?
There you go.
Or you can do another essay, a different essay on how he was a traitor. So I got fewer essays of that type. And I said to them, I'm not going to favor either point of view. Just present the content and the facts, and I'll mark your essay on its merits, right? So you can get an A for saying he was a hero, or you can get an A for saying he was a traitor, as long as you put the right facts in there.
It's just an exercise in critical thinking, is all it is.
Yeah, exactly, and historical evidence, right? Yeah. And I don't think you could ever give that assignment now. It would simply not be accepted. And you wouldn't get called into the principal's office, or
that's right.
Or your department head would talk to you and say, listen, this is not on, right? We all know Louis Riel was a hero.
Yeah, that's right.
When I realized that, I realized, okay, well, if that's the case, then these kids are being indoctrinated, right, into a certain point of view, only one point of view. The other kind of indoctrination I noticed was indoctrination by addition. So I just talked about indoctrination by omission, things disappearing. And now I'm going to talk about indoctrination by addition, because before I retired, there was a course called Social Justice 12, which was introduced about 5 years before I retired, and people didn't pick up on it much. And by the time I retired in 2015, it was starting to gain steam, right? And Social Justice 12 was something I objected to. And I objected to it because I believe the students should get their value system, what they feel is just in society, from a combination of things, from their church, maybe from their family, from an admired uncle or other figure in their experience, and then maybe a little bit from school. But to define for them what social justice was and then tell them that this was it, that was a step too far for me, right?
Yes, definitely.
I didn't teach the course. I avoided it, to be honest with you. And I didn't teach it at all, but I looked at it and studied it a fair amount. And I was concerned about the reductivist approach to social justice topics. So it's the same kind of thinking I was talking about before, which is there's an oppressor and an oppressed. There's a bad guy and a good guy. There's intolerance and tolerance, and we'll define what intolerance is for you. So an example of this, it isn't a verbatim example, but I'll tell you this kind of question that used to be there. Say the question would be like this. Say you are a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, person of color in a classroom, and you're also transgender. How would you feel about the rest of the people in the class who may not agree with that, and your teacher who may harbor hidden resentments against that? Well, that's a very biased point of view about this. There's really only one answer if you want to please your teacher, right?
Right.
Your social justice 12 teacher. So I was very concerned about that. And I was concerned about the idea that were we as teachers in schools actually defining values for students, actually telling them what their values are and should be, and punishing those who disagreed? And more importantly, were we marginalizing objectivity? So when this came in and then I left, I sensed a permanent change in the school ethos and the beliefs and values of the school and of education. As more reductive thinking replaced critical thinking, students were being taught not how to think, but what to think.
Wow.
Yeah, that was evident.
That's huge.
Yeah, that's a huge issue. In my opinion, they should just be given the toolbox. Okay, now you make up your mind, right? After we've taught you for years about how to develop critical thinking, complex issues were being reduced to black and white perspectives. There was no gray, and no shades of gray. So in an amusing kind of a way, it reminded me of a movie that I saw in 1996 called G.I. Jane. Some of you may have seen it, in which Demi Moore's character goes up to her commanding officer with a complaint, and the commanding officer responds by saying, if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you.
Yeah. Way too close to the truth, man.
Yeah, I think that's what was happening. There's only one opinion, and we're going to give this to you.
Mhm.
Well, we hear a lot of talk about misinformation and disinformation these days, and about how governments like to warn us about this, or our present government likes to warn us there's disinformation and misinformation out there. But if students aren't taught critical thinking, okay, or how to detect things like logical fallacies, how are they going to know?
Exactly.
How are they going to know what misinformation or disinformation is? They don't have the tools to do that, right?
That's right.
So one of the things that I realized was that we were training students not to be educated thinkers, but, and this was a hard thing for me to admit, but to be activists. That's what the training was going towards. And,
Wow.
and we weren't training them to be center-right activists or centrist activists or right-wing activists. We were teaching them to be left-wing activists. So,
isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and I think that all activism kind of pollutes education to a certain degree, right?
Yes.
But that's what was happening.
Yeah. Well, that you've talked now about the just the way it's affected education over the years and how it's shifted from what was traditionally understood as giving kids the ability to learn how to learn to now just simply giving them what their opinion should be. But that's the student's experience. That's where education was going. I imagine as a teacher, it would have impacted you too. So did the changes that you noticed begin to affect your role as a teacher? And if so, how did it do that?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say that a lot of what was happening, the indoctrination was happening in a subtle way, right? It was implied, and bias was implied. Sometimes it was just out there, right? Just told to them. But for me as a teacher, yeah, I felt that. I felt less autonomy as a teacher. Now, teachers are supposed to have classroom autonomy up to a certain level, but really, I don't think that you completely do as a teacher, as an educator.
Right.
And one reason is because of things like textbooks. So textbooks changed over time, right? And as a teacher, you don't have the time to create your own textbook. You just don't, right? You can do supplementary materials. There are very few teachers create their own textbook because they disagree with the main textbook. And also those textbooks are bought by the school, so you better use them. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
And creeping social justice themes were evident in content and visual images in the textbooks. And you're kind of obligated to teach from that textbook, especially if no alternate books or sources are available. So one of my favorite times in Social Studies 11 was teaching early 20th century history, right? World War I, that era. So,
Right.
so I noticed that social justice themes were creeping into this, right? Like, Canada entered World War I as part of the British Empire. That may or may not have been mentioned, right?
Right.
And then a question might have been something like, if you were a BIPOC soldier in the trenches, and you were a minority, how would you feel about the command structure? How would you feel about perhaps your commanding officer giving you orders, and so on and so forth? So, so I think that that's a drift away from the policy and facts of Canada at that time, facts of Canada at times, and a reduced emphasis on both facts and and the context of history. I noticed an increased emphasis on anecdotal lived experience and feelings and the topic of oppression, right?
Right.
Were you part of did you have sympathy for an oppressed group? Were you oppressed yourself at that time? And diminished advocacy also for content and hard facts and topics, right? There's quashing, I've already mentioned this, but there's quashing of topics like what a great statesman Sir John A. Macdonald was. And again, I resisted this just the way I resisted Christmas. So when I got to that unit on World War I would purposely put up the precursor to the Red Ensign. Everybody knows what that flag looks like, right? The Red Ensign of up to 1945, because my father served under that flag.
Wow.
I didn't want to disrespect that time in history or his service. The following Red Ensign, and then the Canadian maple leaf flag, right? And what was most astonishing about that was that nobody objected. The kids didn't object. A couple of kids went like, "Oh, cool flags."
What is?
But that's what they said. They said, "What are those flags?"
Wow.
Yeah. So they had no idea. They had no image in the textbook, and they had no idea that this had been Canada's flag for what? How many years? Right, until 1965. If you look at Confederation, that's almost a century. Those flags have been Canada's flags. They had no idea what they were. Right. No reference to the British Empire, because of course that's a colonialist construct, and so on and so forth. Right.
Yeah.
As far as teaching style went, I was purposely retrogressive. So like that made me another dangerous, radical, crazy man in the classroom. So I taught a lot of facts. I emphasized facts, and I also had them copy down notes, right? And I got this from another colleague. I put up a paper, a large piece of paper on the whiteboard, and they had to copy the notes down. So much to my surprise, they actually kind of liked the task involved in that. So I would go around with a small stamp, and I would stamp their notes, as completed, and they would say things like, "You haven't stamped mine." I took my notes. Yeah, so it's like a bit like going back in time. But the feeling was that they didn't need to learn details or facts. They just needed to be able to express their feeling, or they could look facts up on their phone, right? So why would you need to know that? So when was World War I? Well, 1914, 1918, everybody knows that here. But the feeling was that's not important. Answer that question about BIPOC people.
Yeah.
So that unsettled me.
Wow. So now, Perry, you've spoken about the unsettling incidences you experienced, particularly in the latter part of your career.
Right.
And now you've been a retired teacher for a number of years. As you look at education now, from the time that you retired to the present, what concerns do you have now about education as you look at it?
Right. Well, I have two concerns. One is a retired teacher, because I'm always interested in education. But the second is just as a Canadian citizen. I'm concerned from both those perspectives. So one thing I'm deeply concerned about is the erosion of parental rights.
Definitely.
Yeah, that one always disturbed me. I feel that parents have a right to a say in the content of the curriculum. Because if they don't have a say, what if the state is teaching some absurd and bizarre theories, and they don't want their kids to be educated in that manner? Shouldn't they have a say in that?
Yes.
They don't have an opt-out formula. They don't.
That's interesting.
Well, not in BC that I'm aware of. If there is one, someone can enlighten me. But when I first started talking about calling the BCTF about these kinds of policies, they said, no, we don't really have an opt-out formula for this. Most parents, I don't think they take the trouble, unless they're really, really convicted, to make use of an opt-out formula.
Yeah, for sure.
But the content that was coming in disturbed me a great deal. I thought that parents should have a right to be able to speak about that or express their concerns about that. And one example of this is SOGI, right, which is now infamous, sexual orientation and gender identity. BCTF defines it as a toolbox. It's not a subject in school, but it's a toolbox. So the danger in that, from my point of view, is if it's a toolbox, you can use it wherever you want to.
So it's a little more insidious then.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it. So you can spend whole chunks of time on it, as long as you meet the minimum requirements for the content in your course and so on and so forth. So I saw that as being kind of dangerous, right? And as we all know, with the BC election, SOGI played a part in politics, finally has played a part in politics. So it's an issue that parents care about, and that educators, I think, secretly care about. I think parents should be in the loop regarding their children's decisions at school. I think that's criminal that they're not in the loop about that. And it's the special reason that I feel that way is because, if a student goes to the counselor and says that they want to change genders, that can be hidden from the parent. I think that is not correct, and that is actually no other word that I can use, just a criminal negligence on the part of the school system, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So we're a long way from PTAs, Parent-Teacher Association meetings, and
yeah,
a lot of people here can remember that mimeograph sheet you had to take home as a kid, and so you could go to the PTA meeting. Even that idea, Parent-Teacher Association, I don't think that's something that's common so much anymore. Another concern was the unapologetic politicization of the K-12 curriculum. So from the time that they're in primary school to the time that they leave grade 12, there's a political message that's given to them. It's a politically correct, woke political message, right? And I don't think that should be part of education. If we have a balanced educational system, critical thinking and Plato's definition of education should come to the fore, and politicization should be kept out. That is, as I said before, that's how governments use the schools, right? There's a danger in that. So I was just looking up on the BCTF website, and I noticed that there's a course called Genocide 12.
Wow. I wonder where that goes.
Yeah, I wonder where that goes. Well, we all know where that's probably going to go. So as far as I'm concerned, that is unacceptable. I mean, if you can deal with genocide in a social studies 11 course, say something like that, right? But as this particular course that I'm worried about them giving bias to the kids, I don't think that's an acceptable thing. And then also the politicization over minority historical figures concerns me. Like that's out in the society as well too. Johnny McDonald is taken off of the $10 bill as a singular figure. He's put back on amongst a group of people, including the famous five. And then all of a sudden he's gone, just gone. And Viola Desmond is put on the $10 bill. Viola is a very brave woman, right? To buck the system at that time. Very admirable person, but historically, in terms of historical significance, she doesn't come close to Johnny McDonald, who, if anybody knows his life, knows that he actually advocated for Indigenous peoples and so on and so forth. So propaganda on top of propaganda on top of propaganda. Right?
Yes, absolutely. So Perry, this can sound like a lot of gloom and doom because it doesn't look very good at the moment.
Yeah, no,
we have good reason to be fearful in many ways, and yet there's got to be a way forward. So as you look ahead to the future, what hope do you hold for education looking down the road?
Well, since I've dispensed so much gloom and doom, and since I've seen things dismissed, I'm going to surprise you by saying I'm very optimistic about the long-term future of education.
Good.
Yeah, yeah. And
I'm glad.
I'll explain why that mystery is there. Okay. So first of all, it's essential that we reintroduce critical thinking into the schools. That can be done. It's been done in the past. There was a famous course in Ontario by a teacher who introduced logical fallacies and critical thinking. This was back in the 1990s. I think he was a history teacher, had a master's in history in an Ontario school. I forget the actual location. Very popular with the students. They liked the idea of being able to exercise their critical thinking. He got himself into a little bit of trouble because he was teaching logical fallacies. So the kids would go home and their mothers would say things like, clean up your room. And then they would say, why should I do that? Because I'm your mother. And the child would say, that's a logical fallacy. Yeah. So, but the idea of introducing critical thinking is essential. Without it, they're goners. Like they'll be victims of the propaganda machine.
Yes.
So I think that the ideals of education have to be restored. Critical thinking has to be emphasized, and skills have to be maximized. And skills are not being maximized now. Right? Numeracy, I think, is going down. Literacy is going down. I watched a YouTube video the other day, which an ex-educator at the academic level said that students were complaining because they had to read an entire book.
Wow.
They didn't think they could read a book in a week. And
Wow.
the professors, I'm sure there are professors out there who'll back this up. That's astonishing, And yet here this is a student at university. So those standards are going down. But okay, there is a movement afoot, and this movement is in the of classical schools and Christian classical schools, and they're not exactly the same thing, but the curriculum is very much the same.
Yes.
They teach logic, rhetoric, the classics, classical Western civilization, and sharpening intellectual skills, right? So there's last time I looked, which was over a year ago, there were 1,500 in the United States, and they have a classical school association. So I think it's probably more now than it was then, because people are, I think, fleeing the school system any way they can.
Yes.
But there's alternatives in education, more interest in independent schooling in Canada, the United States, and the UK. And more options for independent schools have arisen. So in the UK, there's a school called the King Alfred School. It's in Midlands. And a couple got together and gathered a few ex-educators and some teachers who were unsatisfied with the system, started with a few students, and that school has multiplied. So now they have a network of 4 schools, 2 in London and another one in the Midlands. And their curriculum is just the way I described it. You have to study the classics. You actually have to memorize and recite poetry. Everybody remembers that, I hope.
Yeah.
And and you have to read the great books. You have to report on them, and so on and so forth. There are charter schools in the United States and in Alberta. Now, I'm not sure whether there are charter schools in BC. I think that there aren't, and I base that opinion on the idea that there was a fellow in the northern part of Vancouver Island who was trying to get a charter school movement started but didn't succeed. So I don't know. But there's certainly alternative schools in British Columbia, Christian schools, schools on another basis, and parents should really consider putting their students in those schools and getting them, I think, out of the public school system. There's also the homeschooling movement, which is exploding in America and I think in Canada too. And then there are pods of parents that are organizing so that they can have homeschooling associations and taking the strain off each other, so that one mother will go to babysit the kids here and so on, and that another will go to educate there. So I'm entirely in favor of this, just because of the crisis we're facing in education now, right?
Yes.
I want to go back and refer to Eric Kaufman again, because in a recent webinar that I went to, where he was presenting about woke and the school system, he said that he didn't think that homeschooling itself would be enough. And I have to agree with him. We'll achieve a certain level of success through homeschooling and alternate schools. But I think the government has to step in and set up some kind of framework for impartiality in the schools, and almost like a school inspection process to make sure that the schools are doing it.
Right.
It has to be a legislation for this. I'm not sure if there's actual impartiality in the law in Canada. I think there probably isn't. But in the UK, if I'm not mistaken, it's on the books. I'm not sure how much people actually adhere to it, or what kind of laws that teeth that those laws have. But recently, the National Post put out an article saying that the school system in Ontario was so Marxist that Doug Ford has to step in now.
Right.
So, the school system should never have gotten to that point. It should have been always impartial, always an imparter of facts and education.
Mhm.
So there are some other beacons of hope that I consider to be bright spots in the horizon. So, for example, the parental rights marches that are happening right now.
Yes.
1 million March for Children, which this is the second year I think that it's happened. And I saw a reference to the fact that it was 4 times larger than last year.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's a very hopeful sign. And then we have some real heroes on the educational scene and the free speech scene. One of them was Lindsay Shepherd, and if people have been coming to FDC for a while, they know that we had a presentation with her in July of 2022.
Yes.
And, yeah, remember that?
Mhm. Yeah, it was great.
It was great, yeah. And she got into trouble at Wilfrid Laurier University. She was a teaching assistant, and her crime was that she had presented one point of view, and then she presented a video with Jordan Peterson in it, and some student complained, and that was it. She was suspended, and then she had to go through a kind of kangaroo court inquisition. She was
Yep.
smart enough to record it and reveal what was going on in that event. So she became a free speech hero for a while. She's still active, working with an organization I belong to as well called Civitas.
Right.
And so now you're probably familiar with her, but her book, Diversity and Exclusion, hold this up, Confronting the Campus Free Speech Crisis, details her experience. And so it's an invaluable book to understand what's going on at the academic level, at the university level, right?
Mhm.
So that's a resource that everybody can use to get a handle on what's really going on. Some of it is just astonishing.
Yeah.
So we need more Lindsay Shepherds, more educators to step forth, more rebels, I think, in the educational system. With my protest against Christmas, I don't see myself as like the super rebel or dissident, but teachers have to step forward with this. And I've already mentioned Eric Kaufman twice, but I'll mention him again. He's a Canadian professor who teaches at the University of Buckingham in the UK, and following what he's been doing for a long time. He actually has designed the world's first course on understanding woke ideology.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think you can go on the Buckingham website and you can look at that course. And if I'm not mistaken, it might not be free, but I don't think it's expensive. I would pay just to understand the craziness that's happened over the last 10 to 15 years, right?
Yeah, that would be worthwhile.
And he also has a book, and the book is called The Third Awakening, a 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism. So I just got this in the mail the other day. I'll be reading that from cover to cover. Right? And it's not only these types of educators, but also other brave professors. Like I want to reference Frances Widdowson. Frances Widdowson was a University of Calgary prof. And she was an Indigenous rights activist, but she posted on Twitter and she presented a view that they didn't like about Indigenous affairs. So she was fired. Just
Wow.
fired for having an opinion, right? Basically.
Incredible.
Yeah, incredible. So recently, a court deemed her firing to be inappropriate. So she's passed that hurdle. At least they admitted that it was wrong for them to fire her for having an opinion.
Yeah.
And then, she is suing to get her job back. So if that could happen for us, it would be a tremendous victory. And then there's also there are politicians who are also trying to protect education and parental rights. Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, and Doug Ford to a certain degree in Ontario are trying to do this, and that's a hopeful sign. I'm unfortunately, Blaine Higgs lost the election in New Brunswick,
Mhm.
and he was a great advocate for parental rights. But he did manage to get legislation into the New Brunswick legislature that limited the idea that children as young as 10 or 11 could could go through a transition. They have to be at least 16 now. So, and then lastly, as I wrap all this up, the media. I want to talk about the brave position taken by the National Post and Post media,
Mhm.
countering the narrative that has existed, in the mainstream media, the legacy media. They are, officially legacy media too, but at least they're fighting back. There was the article I mentioned before about the Marxist leanings in Ontario education, and the National Post has just written an article about criticizing the hiring policies of Toronto Metropolitan University. So for those who don't know this, it used to be called Ryerson Institute. It's named after Edgerton Ryerson. When the statue was toppled, the woke forces of wokeness jumped all over that and got the name changed to Toronto Metropolitan University, without really looking into the career of Edgerton Ryerson at all, who actually spoke Indigenous languages, tried to connect with Indigenous people.
Yeah.
And what they're doing is they're limiting the numbers of people in their new medical faculty, and they are preferring that white cis males, for example, do not apply.
Interesting. Wow.
Interesting and horrifying, because that's a blatant racial prejudice.
It certainly is. Yeah.
And the National Post has commented on how that's a violation of charter rights, and other universities are following these kinds of processes which are unconstitutional, according to our Canadian Constitution, and political, right? Just saw one today again in the National Post about UBC and how they are preferring they want to decolonize. They're preferring BIPOC people. So this is deep within the system. But as long as we have, alternate media and people speaking out, we can build a base for that. So
Yeah.
online publications like C2C Journal, and that's a C with 2 and C if you want to look it up, Journal, an excellent online publication on the conservative side and talking about a lot of this stuff. And the Dorchester Review, which is providing resistance to the narrative. So in the end, just let me close by saying that I think it's you and me, citizens like you and me, parent groups, like ex-teachers or teachers who are dissatisfied with what's going on, that provide the backbone of resistance to this indoctrination and to woke ideology. And hopefully we'll be able to create the impetus to resist a biased, indoctrinating educational system.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you, Perry, for that really interesting and very informative presentation. Maybe it makes you think about that event we had a while back where we were featuring Rod Trayer's book, Live Not by Lies.
Yes, yeah.
The whole idea of being dissidents and standing against whatever the oppression is of the day, that we find ourselves in a similar position today where we need to, especially while we still have the freedom to do so, as you say, we have alternate media and we have the opportunity to speak up at this point, yet we need to take full advantage of that while we can.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. I mean, Bill C-63 is coming down the chute. True North has been talking about that and what implications that might have. So yeah, being a dissident can be as simple as writing a letter,
Yeah.
there were dozens, writing to your MLA, getting together with other people who feel the same way. This is all part of the dissident process. So
Absolutely. All right, let's give our listeners a chance. We're going to move now to our question and answer period. So please keep your mics muted for this. We're going to use the chat box for this. So if you have a question, write it in the chat box, and then I will relay it to Perry. I will give you a few minutes to do that. And depending on the number of questions, I might consolidate a few of them just to get through as many questions as possible. And once we get through that, if we have some more time, then we're going to go to an open mic possibility after that. So
yeah, thanks, Mike.
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get my questions up here.
I see we have one in the chat box right now.
Can you see it there? Because I can't see it, Perry. You want to
Oh,
read it?
yeah, okay. Shall I read it?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so Rick Higgins is asking, did you use letter grades in your assessment of a student's performance? John Rustad is going to bring this back to the educational system. Well, yes, I did, right till the end of my my career. I don't think that anecdotal comments alone give us an accurate assessment of how the students have done. That's just, for me, that's just a wishy-washy. There's no criterion involved in that. And so we should stick to the letter grade system. We should stick to definitive ways to gather an assessment of what our students are doing, right? Anything more amorphous just confuses them, in my opinion, and leaves them not knowing where they are. And you may not knowing where you are as well. So Rick has also added this comment. Carrie Isham has started teaching MAP in our local schools, minority attracted person. Right. This is, I hope everybody understands what minority attracted person really means. This means a pedophile or attraction to children. Well, this is, I think, Rick, I think this is the inevitable result of a long decline and very skillful use of language to change the society we're living in. And since they're succeeding on various levels, like Netflix and other forms of entertainment, and they're skirting the edge of this. So I think that were I a director of education, that person would be called into my office, right? And asked how she could possibly justify this kind of thing. I mean, I was watching a Netflix series for about 25 minutes at one point called Cuties, and this was done out of a person in France, and it had 11 or 12-year-old girls gyrating, twerking, if you know what that is. The excuse of the person who had produced this Netflix series, and it was a controversial series, thank goodness, was that she was just trying to show how this could come up, or the hypocrisy behind people's views, or something like that. But in fact, no, that's not what was happening. It was glorifying a form of pedophilia, and it was going out to the wrong people. So I'm sorry to hear that, Rick. That is a ridiculous, but not unexpected thing, and we should be fighting that with everything we have. So can you see the questions, Mike, and all?
I have a question here from Richard. It says, Aaron says that the final stage of totalitarianism is the attack on freedom itself. How does this play out in the educational sphere?
Okay, yeah. Can you repeat that again? I don't see it in the chat, but I want to hear it.
Oh, okay. It says, Aaron, I forget the person's first name now. You know what it's referring to.
Yeah.
Arendt says that the final stage of totalitarianism is the attack on freedom itself.
Yes.
How does this play out in the educational sphere?
Well, I think I've given some examples of it in the presentation that I've given. But you're going to get to the point where there's only one point of view about everything, and you don't have freedom of expression. You don't have freedom of speech. And then it ceases, in my opinion, to be an educational system if you have that, right? If you can't wonder, if you can't have a different point of view, the attack on freedom, or the concept that, a person has, you have weird ideas about freedom, don't you? Or freedom of choice. In fact, you don't care about people or the collective. That's an inevitability if we don't allow and make special protections for freedom. And I think it's time that people and governments start doing that. There's a lot of talk previously from the Conservative Party that they were going to protect freedom of speech in schools and universities, but they didn't come to power. And also, how would you do that? You would have to have strict guidelines, okay, and you would have to make examples of people. But with the way things are now, I think I'm prepared to advocate for that. Right? Anytime freedom of speech is denigrated, then we have a problem. And freedom of speech isn't or shouldn't be anything you say. Like if you say an incendiary remark, like the kind of thing we're seeing right now, that rising anti-Semitism, that's not freedom of speech. That truly is a corrosive element in dialogue, right? And it's something that's advocating for the destruction or killing of people. So that's not freedom of speech. But freedom of speech should be guaranteed within a civil context. Right?
Yeah, for sure. Now, do you have questions in the chat box, Perry? Because I don't have the chat box available.
Sure, I'll just read them out. And
if you don't mind doing that, that'd be great.
No, that's fine. So Patricia says classical education is being taught by homeschool parents in the Cowichan Valley, meeting at St. Andrews 1 day a week. Well, that's wonderful to hear that. Because that classical education is the basis for our society. It's the basis for our ideas about the Judeo-Christian ethic, about parliamentary law, the Magna Carta, the process of democratic education that we've created over centuries. If that is crushed, then anything is permissible, right?
Yes.
So I'm really glad to hear that. I'd like to actually look into that and see what they're doing. It's unfortunate it's 1 day a week. I'd like to actually see them out of the public school system if possible and have an alternative. So great work. So I have a question here from Edward. The October letter from Haven Ministries, written by Richard Dennis, notes that according to a recent Statista poll, over 22% of Gen Zers ages 12 to 27 identify as LGBTQ. Only 1% if boomers see themselves on the LGBTQ spectrum. What's changed? My response, what has changed is that SOGI 123 in BC and equivalents in other areas have worked to normalize and popularize LGBTQ. Alarmingly, this means, I think, that public education has increased the likelihood by 7 times that children in the system will choose to self-identify as LGBTQ. I agree completely with all of this. Shocking to see the statistics, isn't it? But I think the most important word in your question, Edward, is normalize.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's, I think, what's happening on a large scale. They're normalizing various activities that a large amount of people would not agree with. But those people are so cowed and frightened, they're not going to say that they don't agree with them. And that's what I was talking about with the movie Cuties, right? The series Cuties. They're normalizing MAP, minority attracted people. They're normalizing the idea that, for example, communism is wonderful. From a historical point of view, communism was resulting in the deaths of 110 million people in the 20th century. It's never worked. There are only 6 communist countries in the world, and most of them are failing, except for China, which is a state-run kind of capitalism. Right? So it's not communism. So yeah, they seek to normalize these things, and they should be brought up short on that. I think these, ask yourself this question: and would the figure for this be as high in 1958? I don't think so, right? So they're being fed this indoctrination, for want of a better word, and this curriculum, and they're being fed it over and over and over again. And studies like the study of Ed Milgram, the social scientist in New York, who maybe some of you know this experiment. He just conditioned people to keep pressing the button when they were in great pain, right?
Yes.
Just obeyed his orders. So this is a kind of a symptomatic of that. They'll just keep regurgitating what it is that they're told. I don't think this would even have happened in 1980.
Yeah, good point.
And we're back to Richard's question about Hannah Arendt says that the final stage of totalitarianism is the attack on freedom itself. How does this play out in the educational sphere? Well, I think a lot of educators, to go back to that question, a lot of educators, they fear for their jobs.
Good point. Yeah.
That's a terrible place to be in. If you have an alternate point of view, aren't you supposed to be enlightening students and giving them that point of view and letting them work out with the skills they have, which one they agree with? But I think that, in most major universities right now, any kind of conservative professor would be living in fear, right? And so what that brings about is a sense of self-censoring. So I think it was Matthew Goodwin in the UK who basically said that he'd taken polls of centrist or conservative educators, and what they revealed was that these people were self-censoring by a wide margin. So 60% of them were 70 to 80% were simply self-censoring to keep their jobs. So that means we're under an educational regime, right? And not unlike one like that these Germans used to, participating with Stasi, their secret police. People are listening to you, listening to your conversations. There's certain things you just can't say, right?
Mhm.
So my hat's off to all the educators out there. UVic, VIU, anywhere that there's educators that are going forward with what they consider to be valuable classical education and a balanced point of view of this, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so Bodicea is the next questioner. One concern is the education training of new teachers. New teachers are influenced by the university ethos, and then these new teachers take that politicized perspective into their roles as new teachers. Do you notice this change among new or younger teachers? Well, I haven't been in touch with a lot of new or younger teachers. It's been 9 years since I retired, but I do make contact with Generation Z, Generation Z, whoever you want to pronounce that. If I'm a Canadian, I'll pronounce it Generation Z. These people are 24 years old or 30 years old. They're my ex-students. I keep connected with them. And there's a rising conservative feeling amongst them. A lot of this is based on the idea that they can see that their generation has been kind of unfairly given a scenario in which they can't succeed, right? And so they detest that. They can't get a home. They can't, it's harder for them to start families. They have to string together 3 jobs to make the equivalent of 1 job in 1975, something like that. But they're just also very, very tired of left-wing progressive ideology. They can't say it at work sometimes, but a lot of them are now turning to voting for conservatives. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think a large number of voters in the BC provincial election were between the ages of 18 and 24, and they voted conservative, right? So maybe younger teachers will be coming in and bucking the system or working in an alternative school system. And Linda says, not to sound too pessimistic, I wonder if the powers that be actually want an educated, critical thinking citizenry. Otherwise, why would the curriculum eliminate performance standards and discourage dissenting opinions? I feel like I'm watching an alarming dumbing down of the population. Yeah, exactly. I don't think they want an educated, critical thinking citizenry. That would be Aristotle's idea, right? Or Plato's idea. More Aristotle than Plato. But they don't want that. I think they want a compliant citizenry. And I don't think it's too far out to go there. We're always, those of us who are conservatives are often, we've been, in this last election, again, we were accused of being conspiracy theorists, right? So there's a great conspiracy out there, but sometimes you just notice it, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not to do with conspiracy theories at all. It's just to do with what you see, right? I don't think that they want us to read the classical authors of old, because we'll start to think.
Yeah, horror of horrors.
Yeah, horror of horrors. An educated citizenry that will buck their policies, right? We don't want that. So more and more, I haven't put my tinfoil hat on completely, right? But there's a bit of tin on my head. Let's put it, and I feel like I'm watching alarming dumbing. Yes, that's right. There's been alarming dumbing down of the situation, and dumbing down of the population, and it's shocking, really. I mean, everybody remembers, I think, the Book of the Month Club. They used to give away that set of books that I have, Will and Ariel Durant's The Story of Civilization, as your gift when you joined the Book of the Month Club, right?
Wow.
Yeah, people used to read it, and not always academics used to read it, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's an alarming dumbing down. One more question, then we'll go to open mic. It's very clear in my years as a public school teacher. Edward, hello, how are you? that expected political affiliation for teachers was only socialist. Yeah. It should be clear that if this is generally true in our province, one narrative perspective will be presented to students. Well, yeah, naturally, Edward, good point. And as a conservative teacher, or a teacher who grew to be conservative over the years, I was actually toying with the idea of setting up a conservative teachers association, right? Just because you don't want to feel like the only one with these feelings or these convictions.
Yeah.
I think that would have been crushed.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I think so.
Certainly today.
Yeah, it would have been, well, what are the appellations they give to us? Well, you're a dangerous, right? It's a dangerous ideology, or you ought to be watched, which reminds me of Stasio.
You're purveyors of misinformation and
purveyors of misinformation, disinformation. You're dangerous, and you know, maybe what Justin Trudeau would say: you're a racist, a homophobe, a misogynist, and Islamophobe, all in one.
That's right.
That goes without saying, right? So I think the executive of the BCTF is overwhelmingly socialist, far left socialist, and most teachers go along with that. So that's unfortunate. But it can be changed through a parallel polis, creating other systems and infiltrating the system. How's that for a dissenter's point of view?
Beautiful. Well, should we move then to a open mic?
Let's move to an open mic.
Okay. So let me give you a few heads up on this. Use a hand icon. You'll find it on your screen, depending on what computer you have, on the top or the bottom. Use the hand icon, because then you'll end up in a queue and we'll know who's asking the question. Don't wave your hand, we might miss you. So if anyone has a comment or a question they want to put to Perry, please click on your hand icon and we will acknowledge you, and we'll go to an open mic session now.
Hey, Irene has something she really wants to ask and she can't find the hand icon. So please let her use her real hand.
A real hand.
Absolutely. Go ahead. Thank you.
I can do that. All right. Okay. Hi, Irene. How are you?
Irene, your mic is muted, so you need to.
Mic is muted. Yeah, you have to click on the demuting. So
is it unmuted now?
Yeah, it is
unmuted. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I have really been listening to so much of what you've been saying, Perry, because we are living it.
Yes.
And our great concern right now, I think we have had our eyes opened to what's happening in our public schools with the situation in the Ladysmith Middle School, where there is a student who is placed in a classroom with a transgendered teacher who had the pride flag on the wall, Soji banners, a poster with all the proper pronouns that you have to memorize. And this child has felt uncomfortable since day one in that classroom, has been begging to be moved out. The parents have both tried on everything they know to have the principal move this child, and he has not been allowed to move out of that classroom.
Yeah.
And if it had been any other type of religion or political thought or whatever, would this have been allowed? Why is this allowed? And is there anything, Perry, that you know of that can influence a school to listen to the needs of a student?
Right. It doesn't surprise me really, because would you be surprised if that happened in East Germany? You know, really, that's where we're at. I mean, they're struggling in Ontario just to get LGBTQ flags removed from classrooms, and not because they have any particular animus towards these people, but just because they want a balanced perspective in the classroom, right? Just impartial or neutral, you know? So I would say to those people, link up with other people. It's time to do this, you know? Link up with other people I think in the resistance, and then complain, you know, and maybe even go to the school board meetings. And I can't really advise this because I don't know the law well, but take legal action, you know, somehow take legal action. Nobody wants to walk point, right? I mean, I didn't even want to become a recognized figure in the conservative movement, but we have to start taking these people to court about this. We have to develop a movement against this. And I see that there are movements, anti-Soji movements on the mainland right now. especially in Surrey North and places like that. Maybe connect with them and find out what they did and then duplicate it, you know, in the Surrey North area. Also, you know, I just saw a YouTube video about John Rustad being interviewed by an incredibly biased CBC reporter who just mocked him. But what he said was he went back to the SOGI curriculum and he said there are pornographic books in the schools. So the guy said, no, there are not pornographic books in the schools and to do with SOGI. And he said, I'll bring them and I'll show you. So really, that's what we have to do. You know, I don't think anybody wants to be a dissident. In fact, I'm thinking of a post called I was an involuntary dissident, because at a certain point it just gets to be unbearable, and so against common sense that you have to take action. And then when you have to take action, you have to know the tools you need to do that, right? So the North Surrey district, I would look into that. I would look into the rise of the SOGI movement in the BC Conservative Party, because that was a big issue in this election. I was so happy to see that it actually became an issue, that it could actually be broached as an issue, you know, and that it could win votes. Politically, it could win votes, right? So that's what I would recommend doing. But do your homework first. You know, don't put your head out there so it can be chopped off right away. You know, get out there, find people who feel as you do. So networks are important, right? In any kind of resistance movement, networks are important.
Barry, we have a gentleman, our career.
Our Carreri, that's
Carreri, there he is.
I think I know that gentleman, and I've known him, I think, since 1977, but that could just be. All right, so.
Am I on?
You're on, yes.
Okay, just Barry, thanks for all the detail and your perspective. And Barry and I go way back. We went to university together, graduated from university in the same year, and we're still friends. And I taught for 8 years, and I was a school principal for 24 years, and retired just a little bit before Perry. I just wanted to put a little context, add a little bit of context, and for me, my experience in public education, things really started to change in the early 80s. And what happened in the early 80s was that the government of the day determined that the BCTF would become the bargaining agent for every school district in the province. And prior to that, we had collective bargaining, but the administrators, the teachers, and the trustees in each school district determined their own fate, okay?
Oh.
And there's a few points of relevance there. One is that the communication was personal, okay? And people actually talked to each other, and common sense had the opportunity to prevail in most circumstances. So if we were talking about matters related to finances, agreements were always made because we only had so much money to spend. When it was regarding matters of curriculum, parents were highly involved in the process. And I remember specifically in the 80s when the family life curriculum was being introduced in public education. We had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of parents attend meetings over a period of time to determine whether or not they thought the content and the delivery of the program was reflective of their community, right? So my point is that where we are now and where we were then is completely different.
Yeah.
Okay. And for the people above who have a child in a classroom whose emotional well-being is at stake, and there's no amount of logic that you can use with the powers that be to convince them to do the right thing, which is to move the child, right, is another indicator of how deep in this hole we are.
Yeah.
My personal opinion is that parents have to get back into schools and take take responsibility for public education away from the Ministry of Education. All of our schools will live on the island, I presume, but all of our schools were literally built from the ground up, from the people that started our communities.
Mhm.
And we're a long way away from that.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's very, very true. And it's interesting that you use the term ministry, right?
Yeah.
The Ministry of Education. Of course, everybody's who here probably thinks about 1984, right? Ministry of Truth and so on.
Yeah,
and so
that's
forth.
right.
And you
The
get
same
that.
thing.
Yeah, it's the same thing. And I was astounded to find out, what the Federal Ministry of Education in the United States, when that started? The Ministry of Education? 1978.
Yeah.
Before that, they didn't have any of this. No, states handled it individually, and America had the #1 educational system in the entire world, especially in California, which lately has ranked 45th out of 50 states. So, do we need these kinds of things? I think we don't need these kinds of things. These overwhelming bureaucracies, and who knows? I've been writing a lot about this on Substack and in my podcast in Substack about who knows who these bureaucrats are. I wrote one post called 5 Against 1, which described the people arrayed against government, the mass media, the K-12 system, and academia, okay, and permanent government bureaucrats. So the people are now struggling against all these entities to have their will recognized, right? And that's not what democracy is all about, is it? We have a constitution from 30 different sources that is supposed to guarantee us freedom, right? And a charter that's supposed to guarantee us freedom, and that should be freedom of education as well. So,
Excellent. We should bring things to a close. Is there
Okay.
anyone that has a final question or comment? Otherwise, we'll do that. Well, before we finish up this evening, we want to say thank you so much to Perry for preparing this event, for the work that he put into it, for this presentation. It's very timely, very important. And as we can see, in many ways, it's a microcosm of the larger struggle that we are facing as conservatives, as Canadians,
yes.
in a situation that is very much moving towards the authoritarian and totalitarian mindset.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Perry. Before you go, I would like to encourage the attendees with a couple of things. First of all, I'd like you to consider subscribing to our Substack and Rumble channels. Avail yourselves of the material that's there, the articles and what have you. And also, please check out our new podcast. That would also be wonderful.
Those things are free.
Yeah, exactly. So these are all available to you for free. So that's why we encourage you to be members also, so because it helps us to keep providing these things for free.
Exactly.
So thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's much appreciated. It's been a blessing to have you all here. All the best to you, and we wish you a pleasant good evening. Good night, everyone.